Over the last year, I've built a couple of these turning saws. I did the first one with the great Uri Tuchman, who made beautiful pins out of brass and handles out of lovely hardwood. Then I made the wooden parts and we put everything together, and the final tool was fantastic. I really learned to love it. But, this isn't a channel about making fancy stuff. It's a channel about back to basics, simple woodworking. So I had to make the Woodwork for Humans version, which any reasonably experienced woodworker can make out of scrap wood and random hardware. And once you use this tool a little bit, you'll realize that it is so much better than a coping saw. It does curves and fine work, all sorts of details, and basic tasks like cutting out the waste from in between dovetails. It is really an essential tool. You've got to have one. But a tool like this is also part of this thing I call the beginner paradox. There are some tools that you really have to build up your woodworking skills. But in order to build them, you have to have some woodworking skills to begin with. Kind of like a workbench. And of course, there are some turning saws that you can buy, but they are pricey. So, what's the solution for a beginner woodworker who wants one of these things? Well, what if the tool came as a kit? What if it came with all the wooden parts already roughly cut out and shaped, nice turned handles, beautifully machined steel pins, and then you could assemble it, shape it, personalize it, finish it, and you'd have your own tool that you could put together for a reasonable amount of money, and you could get some skills in the process. That would be amazing. Of course, putting together a kit like this, that is a huge undertaking. I would need at least 3 or 4 different manufacturers. I'd have to get all the parts made. I'd have to get them together, get them working together, get them distributed to people at a reasonable price. When I think about it, a project like this, making this kit, it sounds like a great way for me to lose a lot of money. So why would somebody buy this tool as a kit, especially when I've already made a video about how you can make it out of scrap wood? Well, in order for this to be a viable product, it's got to solve problems for the user. Problem number 1 is the pins that hold the blade. Turning saw pins are pretty complicated. They need to be slit in 2 directions to accept the blade, and the little pin that holds the blade in place. The pins also need a flange that transfers the tension of the blade from the handles to the frame. On my homemade pins, I did this with a pair of nuts and a washer. It works, but it's hardly an elegant solution. The best thing that came from this approach was being able to grab the pin with a wrench, and since I used threaded rod to make the pins, they threaded right into the handles. I added some glue on the original build, but it wasn't really necessary. The threads will hold by themselves. I can just close my eyes and picture the pins that are going to be in my kit. A sleek, all-steel design, 2 perfect slots in the end to hold the blade, a big flange in the middle, and a long threaded section that's going to sink right into that wooden handle. Of course, I can't make something like this. I wouldn't even know where to start. But I do make things for a living, and I have colleagues. This is Quinn. She's a machinist, and she runs the excellent channel Blondihacks, one of my favorite machining channels. I asked her to send me a clip of her waving hi to the camera, but she thought no, dancing is better. I love my job. Anyway, Quinn was totally into the project, and she said, "This is great, but we need some place to start. Can you draw me something?" And I was like, yes. Clearly, I'm no master of mechanical drawing, but that's the great thing about working with a skilled craftsperson. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to communicate the idea. Quinn took my sad attempt at drafting and generated a blueprint that you could actually work from. We made a couple of tweaks to the design, and she got to work. If you've never seen it before, machining is a little bit like woodworking. You begin with stock that's bigger than the finished part, and you cut away everything you don't need. Here, Quinn is using a metal lathe to turn the raw stock down to the correct diameter. A metal lathe is similar to a wood lathe, but it's much heavier and more rigid, and the cutting tool is attached to the machine, so it can withstand the huge forces involved in turning solid steel. Machining also requires a lot of patience. This clip is actual speed, and this is only the first pass. And you thought hand tool woodworking was slow. As Quinn continues to shape the piece, You can see that flange developing in the center of the part. Those ridges on the face come from taking successive passes across the work, but she'll clean those up in a later step. Once this part is done, she can flip it around and cut the threads on the handle end. Metal lathes really excel at threading. It's one of the machine's main functions, but doing it is a real skill. Quinn even custom ground the threading tool to cut wood threads. It's pretty impressive. The final operation might be the most difficult. Quinn has to cut 2 slots at precise angles on a round part. So she's got the part set up in the milling machine, and she's using a slitting saw. In principle, this is similar to a table saw. The spinning blade is stationary, and the part is slowly fed in while being held securely in a vise. Quinn even custom built the arbor that the saw blade is spinning on. I'll link to that video down in the description. And the final parts? Yes! This is why you work with talented people to make your ideas real. I don't have the tools or the knowledge to make anything close to the sleek steel parts that Quinn made. I know it wasn't easy for her, but she did it. The completed pins also work exactly the way I need them to. Those slots let the blades slide right in while gripping the pins securely. These are the blades from Tools for Working Wood, and I think they're the best. But maybe you want to make your own blade, or use a piece of bandsaw blade for a cheap alternative. No problem. We've also designed these pins with a hole that's perfectly sized to take a finishing nail, so you can make your own blade and use common nails for the pins. However you want to do it, we've got you covered. Okay, now we've got the blades and the hardware figured out. The next thing we have to sort out is these curved arms, and they're fairly complicated. Of course, you could do something simpler, but this traditional design evolved over generations, and it's really well suited to the tool. It cuts down on excess mass, it's ergonomic, and it also looks nice. I really want this shape to be in my kit. Of course, I'm not going to stand down here for days and days cutting these things out of the bandsaw. I don't have time for that. Luckily, shapes like this are the exact reason that human beings invented the CNC. Now, I don't own a CNC or know the first thing about programming one, but my buddy Brad has one, and he knows how to use it. So I sent him the plans for my turning saw, and he wrote a toolpath to turn those drawings into a finished part. Brad's using kiln-dried red oak. It's a common species that will stand up to the tension of the saw blade while also keeping costs down. Brad is cutting the part along the grain for maximum strength. I should mention that Brad is also an outstanding wood turner, and his channel Brad's Wood Turning is very fun. I'll put a link down in the description. It's easy to see how CNC technology makes mass-producing parts like this much more realistic. You can run a bunch of parts in one batch, and they can be nested together to save materials. Once Brad cuts a batch, he just pops them out and knocks off any splinters with a little sandpaper. A CNC can make beautifully curved arms, and cut the piece for our stretcher too. Now, all the important and difficult parts are made, and we know how to mass produce them. Just having the frame and the hardware would make a really good kit, especially if I added some string and maybe a piece of wood to make your toggle out of. But I want my kit to be really deluxe, so let's add some lovely turned handles. I've got a nice piece of figured maple, and I'm mounting it up in the lathe. After watching Quinn working with an unforgiving material like steel, it's amazing to just take the turning tool in my bare hands and blow through a ½ an inch of wood like it's nothing. I feel like a god. I'm no machinist, but a wood lathe can do some precision work, especially with drilling. This operation would be very similar on a metal lathe, and my holes are dead center. I do the drilling early while I still have lots of stock to support the piece in the chuck. Then I can bring my tailstock back in to support the work while I turn the actual shape. I don't know much about mass-producing parts like these, but I do know there are factories that do CNC wood turning, even places that specialize in simple parts like these. I bet I can do a drawing, write a check, and get a big box of handles already drilled and sanded, ready for assembly. So here's my vision for this kit. You get it? You open the box, and you can immediately start putting it together. You grab the handles in your vise, and they're already drilled at exactly the right size for those pins. You just get a little wrench and thread them in. I think on the next version, we might even move the flat spots up to the flange to make it even easier to grip with a cheap adjustable wrench. There's always another tweak you can make to the design. Then, you drill the pinholes in the frame. That's easy, and the pins slide right through. Next, you'll make a temporary stretcher out of whatever scrap wood you have sitting around. I'm using pine. You'll set up the frame with a blade and slowly shoot the ends of the temporary stretcher until it sits right in those flat spots and the arms are parallel. Add a bit of string and a scrap of wood for tightening, and you'll have a saw ready for testing. Even with that scrap wood stretcher held in with just friction, the saw works brilliantly, and you can cut any curve you like. Now, with any turning saw, you have to attach the permanent stretcher to the arms. The stretcher has to stay in place, but it has to be a loose connection that will allow the parts to pivot as the saw is tightened and loosened. But there are lots of ways to skin this cat. When I built my collaboration saw with Uri, I used the traditional mortise and tenon. It doesn't have to be quite as precise as a furniture joint because you're not gluing it, but it's still not exactly beginner's work. Another way to handle this connection is the bridle joint. It's a little bit bulkier than the traditional mortise and tenon, but it works just as well, and it's much easier to cut. You make a couple of rips with a tenon saw, chisel out the waste in between them, and you've got a joint that will lock right into those arms and stay in place. But you know, if I'm making a kit for the beginner woodworker, even that bridle joint might be a little bit too complicated. But wait a second. Am I really trying to suggest that I have another way to do this, another trick up my sleeve that's just as good as the bridle or the mortise and tenon, but even easier? Well, yeah, of course I do. You can use your temporary stretcher as a template and trim the hardwood stretcher until they're exactly the same. The stretcher from the kit will be extra long, so you can cut tenons or whatever you want. But for this technique, we're going to make it the same length as the temporary stretcher. Once the piece is trimmed, I'll set it up in the vise and tap a couple of finishing nails into the end. I've laid out my locations, so they'll be right in the middle of the piece. Now I'll clip off my nails, which leaves a nice sharp end. And when I press those clipped nails into the side of my arm, they leave a couple of clear marks in the wood. When I pull the nails out of my stretcher, I've got two holes that line up perfectly with the marks I just made in the arm. I can drill those holes out and just drop in a loose tenon like a dowel or even a piece of chopstick. That will actually work perfectly. A little super glue and a couple short pieces of chopstick make my tenons, and then I'll just drill the marks in my arms with a slightly larger bit to give myself a little wiggle room. The loose tenons drop right into their holes, and we use two of them, so the stretcher can't twist. Honestly, this method is just as good as any of the others, and I think anyone can do it. Now we're on to the fun part of the project. A saw like this would have been a point of pride for the craftsman who made it. It was a chance to show off your skill, so this is a great time to shape and chamfer all the parts of the saw. You can add some simple carvings or decorations. You can make this tool completely personal. A couple weeks ago, Shannon Rogers told me that I should make the tops of my arms thinner and more delicate, so that this saw would balance better and be easier to control. That sounds like good advice, and because I'm making this saw from a kit where all the hard work has already been done, I can get right into the artistic and ergonomic parts. I can shape and blend parts together and make the tool fit my hand exactly. I often rush through this step because everything's on a deadline and I need my tool ready to use. But if I'm working from a kit, I have lots of extra time to personalize it. When I'm done shaping, final assembly is a snap. All the parts pop together, and I can get the saw tensioned up and ready to use. And just like the other turning saws I made, this one works beautifully. The mass and long throw of the saw means it slices through hardwood like butter, and you can freehand any curve you can imagine. The blade rotates a full 360 degrees in the frame, so you can also cut in any direction. This is truly an essential tool, and it's even better if you make it yourself. Making a physical product like this is so complicated. I mean, it took 3 separate people just to make the prototype. When I go to have this mass produced, I'm probably going to need 3 different manufacturers. All the parts are going to have to end up in the same place. They're all going to have to work together. Then there's shipping and fulfillment and customer service. I mean, if I'm honest, the whole thing is a little bit intimidating. And I know if you're watching this, you probably have a lot of questions. Rex, when is this thing going to be available? What's it going to cost? Are you going to ship internationally? And I do not know. I don't have the answers to any of those questions. This is a long road, and I'm still just getting started. But I am interested in feedback. So if there are certain features you'd like to see in this kit, or certain things you want me to include, or if you can think of a price that you would want to pay for something like this, go ahead and leave me a comment down in the description. I always love constructive feedback. You know, I'm coming to the end of this video, and it's a good video, I'm happy, but I don't know, something's missing. We need something. Oh, I've got it. Ah, that's it. Now the video's done. And hey, you can go check me out at patreon.com/RexKruger if you'd like to be one of the people who make these videos possible. I have all kinds of exclusive content, incentives, and rewards for the people who support this work. You can also check out Quinn over on Patreon, where she has a big and active following, and you should absolutely go subscribe to her channel, Blondihacks. It is really entertaining, even if you're not a machinist. I'm not a machinist, and I watch her channel all the time. I'll be back next week with another woodworking video, and I really hope you'll come join me. Make sure you hit that bell icon so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching.